After days of watching James work in her garden, Ava developed feelings for him after spending so many years alone. Unable to hold back any longer, she walked over and hugged James from behind. "James, I have feelings for you." Caught completely off guard, James quickly pulled Ava's hands away and stepped aside. "Ava, you hired me to work here, and that's why I came. I want to focus on my job, and more importantly, I already have a family. Please don't do this again." With that, James turned around and went back to his work. Deep down, Ava knew her actions were wrong and went against ordinary moral values. But her overwhelming desire to have a child at this stage of her life had clouded her judgment and pushed aside the careful reasoning she once had. More than 2 hours had passed as James stood outside the gate of a large suburban home, calling several times without hearing a reply. Thinking no one was there, he turned to leave when he heard something being set down inside, followed by a woman's voice, a dog barking, and footsteps crossing the stone path. "Excuse me? Are you looking for a gardener?" James called out, raising his voice so the person inside could hear him. A woman stepped onto the front porch and said, "Give me just a minute." James squinted through the gate, trying to make out her face from the distance. A short time later, she walked toward him. She appeared to be in her early 40s, with a tall, slender figure and an easy, unhurried stride. It was clear she had lived a comfortable life, one that spared her from the constant physical labor that wore down so many working people. Ava reached the gate, unlocked it, and invited James inside. "When did you get here? Have you been waiting long?" she asked. Her manner was friendly and respectful, making James feel more like a welcome guest than someone hired for a job. He had met wealthy people who treated laborers as if they were beneath them, but Ava was nothing like that. Even after only a brief meeting, he could already tell she was an honest and decent person. "I got here this afternoon, but no one answered when I called," James said as he followed Ava through the property. Along the walkway, he noticed neatly arranged trees, flower beds, and carefully maintained landscaping that made the place feel cool and inviting. "My name is Ava. I'm not that old, so you can just call me by my name," she said with a small smile. "Calling me ma'am makes me feel older than I am. Then I'll call you Ava." "My name is James," he replied, hoping he wasn't being disrespectful. She didn't object, which put him at ease. "Sorry for keeping you waiting. I didn't realize you were coming today. I was out in the backyard gathering some vegetables for dinner," Ava explained, pointing to a basket sitting near the patio. She led him inside, but James hesitated at the entrance. His boots were dusty from work, and he worried about tracking dirt onto the polished floor. Seeing him pause, Ava said, "Go ahead and come in. It's fine. Have a seat while I get you something to drink." Only then did James step inside and sit carefully on one of the expensive wooden chairs. It was unlike anything he had ever used before, and he found himself thinking he could work his whole life and still never afford furniture like this. His eyes wandered around the room, taking in the elegant woodwork, finely crafted details, and the quality of everything on display. The house spoke of long-standing wealth and careful upkeep. A moment later, Ava returned carrying a glass of cold water and a large plate of fresh fruit before taking the seat across from him. "The backyard hasn't been taken care of for a long time," Ava said. "It's overgrown with weeds, and I'd like to fix it up so I can grow some vegetables again." James accepted the glass of water with both hands and nodded. "You can leave it to me. I've done this kind of work for years. It should only take a few days to get everything in shape." "Shirley told me you're known for being careful and reliable," Ava replied. "That's why I asked her to invite you over. There's no need to rush. Just do the job the way you normally would. And if I'm happy with the results, I'll make it worth your while. To be honest, I live here alone, so I have to hire people whenever something this heavy needs to be done." James looked surprised by her answer. "You live here by yourself? Someone your age should already have a husband, shouldn't they?" At James's question, Ava's expression changed. She let out a quiet sigh before answering. "I was married once, but after years together, we never had a child. I still don't know whether the problem was with me or with him. In the end, I chose to let him go so he could find the life he wanted. Since then, I've lived here by myself." Hearing her story, James felt sorry for her. It seemed unfair that someone so attractive and kind had ended up carrying such a painful burden. Everyone hoped for a happy family and someone to share life with, especially as they grew older. He couldn't imagine how much she must have gone through before deciding to live alone. You're still young enough to find someone, James said. Having a partner would make life easier. If you ever got sick, there'd be someone to take care of you. Ava looked out the window for a moment before replying, I'm used to being on my own now. If something happens, Shirley can come help me. Besides, if I can't have children, I'd only feel like I was holding someone else back. James shook his head. Maybe you've just been too selective. A woman like you wouldn't have any trouble finding a good man. At least you'd have someone to share the house with and keep you company. Ava gave an embarrassed smile. It's not that. I've simply lived alone for so long that it feels normal. I'm comfortable with the way things are, and I've never had a problem living by myself. After talking for a while, the daylight began to fade. James stood up and prepared to leave. Before seeing him out, Ava said, My place is big, and you've come a long way to get here. If the drive feels too much, you're welcome to stay the night. There are several empty guest rooms, so just pick one and make yourself comfortable. Early the next morning, just after daybreak, James arrived at Ava's house carrying his gardening tools. You're here early, Ava said. Come inside and have a cup of tea before you start working. She had always been thoughtful, especially toward the people she hired. I'd rather get started while it's still cool outside, James replied as he headed toward the backyard, but Ava stopped him. There's no rush. Sit down and have some hot tea first. You'll still have plenty of time to work afterward. Then thank you, James said. It's nothing, Ava answered. You're helping me, so the least I can do is make you a pot of tea, James smiled. To be honest, there aren't many homeowners like you. I've worked in a lot of places, and some people barely treated workers like us with any respect, let alone offered us something to drink. I think people are people. Some are just fortunate enough to live more comfortably than others. I only wish everyone saw things the way you do. After finishing his tea and exchanging a few more words with Ava, James headed to the backyard and got to work. Using the tools he had brought with him, he cleared away the tall, overgrown weeds first, then worked through the smaller plants underneath. He stayed focused on the job, moving steadily from one section to the next until a large part of the yard was completely cleaned up. In just one morning, he had already restored an area nearly the size of Ava's front lawn. Watching from inside the house, Ava was impressed by both his speed and his attention to detail. She decided that once the work was finished, she would give him extra pay in addition to what they had agreed on. James was 49, but years of physical work had kept him strong and energetic. His skin was darkened by long days under the sun, and he had earned a solid reputation in the neighboring community as a dependable landscaper who never cut corners. Whatever job he accepted, he handled it with care, which was why so many people trusted his work. Ava spent most of the morning watching him from inside the house. At first, she was simply impressed by how focused he was, but before long, she found herself unable to look away. She wasn't sure whether it was his dedication to the job or the sight of his broad shoulders as he worked, but something about him held her attention. As she continued watching, an unfamiliar feeling quietly stirred inside her. Watching James brought back memories Ava had tried to bury for years. She remembered the pain of her failed marriage and the hurtful words she had endured because she never had a child. No one truly knew whether the problem had been hers or her ex-husband's, but the marriage had ended all the same. She had wanted to become a mother more than anything, yet after more than 5 years together, that dream never came true. Since the divorce, she had lived alone and often wondered whether her former husband had eventually started a family with someone else. Strangely, after meeting James, the desire to have a child had returned with unexpected force. She had believed those feelings disappeared the day her marriage ended, but now they were stronger than ever. The only question she could not answer was who she could possibly have a child with after spending so many years keeping her distance from every man who came into her life. Over the years, many men had shown interest in Ava. Some were wealthy, some were young, and some came from prominent families, but she had turned every one of them down. Then James came to work at her house, and after only a few days, an unexpected thought crossed her mind. What if she had a child with him? She barely knew him, yet she found herself drawn to his honesty and quiet character. It felt as though the longing she had buried for years had finally resurfaced. Deep inside, she still wanted love, and more than anything, she wanted the chance to raise a child of her own. But James was a married man with 2 children, and from the way he spoke about his family, she could tell he cared deeply for them. She knew it would be wrong to interfere with another family's happiness. Even so, the desire would not leave her. Part of her believed she might never be able to have children, but another part still wanted to try just once. Several more days passed, and the backyard was almost finished. In another 2 days at most, James would be done with the entire project. During that time, Ava could not stop thinking about having a child with him. More than once, she found herself quietly watching him from a distance, worrying that once the work was over, she might never have another chance. The fact that James already had a wife and children made her hesitate, yet another thought kept returning to her mind. What if she could have a child after all? She would never know unless she tried. Determined not to let the opportunity slip away, Ava went inside, poured a glass of cold homemade fruit drink, arranged a plate of fresh fruit, and carried them out to the backyard. "James, take a break and have something to drink before you keep working," she said as she handed him the tray. "Thank you, Ava. That's very kind of you," James replied, accepting the glass. "I made the drink myself," she said. "It's especially refreshing on a hot day like this." As she spoke, Ava casually adjusted the hem of her pants, exposing part of her bare leg above the knee. James took another sip and nodded. "It's really good." Ava smiled and looked at him. "Do you really think I'm beautiful?" she asked. There was a hint of shyness in her expression as she picked up a blade of grass and rolled it between her fingers. After a brief pause, she looked at him again. "Tell me honestly, between me and your wife, Serena, who do you think is prettier?" The question caught James off guard. He wondered why she would ask something like that, then assumed it was simply the kind of comparison many women made. After thinking for a moment, he answered truthfully, "My wife is a hardworking woman who spent her life taking care of our family. She doesn't have the time to worry about her appearance. But you're different, Ava. You always look well put together. Your skin is well cared for, and most people would probably guess you're much younger than you really are. To be honest, Serena can't compare to you in that respect." Ava's smile grew even brighter after hearing his answer. She moved a little closer and lowered her voice. "If I still look this young and attractive, do you like me, James?" The sudden question left him speechless. He instinctively took a small step back and stared at her in confusion. "Ava, why would you ask me that?" he said awkwardly. "Someone like me could never dream of a woman like you. I'm just an ordinary working man." Deep down, James would be lying if he said he felt nothing. Ava was beautiful, successful, and carried herself with quiet confidence. But he was a married man, and the thought of betraying Serena never sat right with him. He refused to throw away the family that had stood beside him through years of hardship. Uncomfortable with how close the conversation had become, James quickly finished his drink, stood up, and brushed the dirt from his clothes. "I should get back to work now, Ava." As soon as James stood up, Ava stepped forward and wrapped her arms around him from behind. Since he usually took off his shirt while working to stay cool, her embrace caught him completely by surprise. His whole body stiffened, and he froze for a moment before trying to pull away. "Ava, I'm a married man," he said nervously. "You live here alone, and if someone sees us like this, there's no way I could explain it." He tried to free himself, but Ava only held on tighter. "I'm not worried about what people might say," she replied. "They've talked about me for years anyway." James kept struggling to loosen her grip. "But if my wife hears about this, she'll misunderstand everything. I don't have money or status. I'm not young anymore. I can't understand why you'd even look at someone like me." Resting against his back, Ava answered honestly, "I stopped looking for anyone a long time ago. But after meeting you, I realized how much I miss being cared for. You were the one who told me I shouldn't spend the rest of my life alone." James shook his head. "I meant you should find a good husband, not me. There are plenty of men who would be a better choice than I am." After several tense moments, he finally managed to pull himself free from her arms. Although Ava was disappointed, she let James go and stood quietly for a moment before speaking again. "Then stay for dinner tonight," she said. "I'll cook for you myself. It's been a long time since I shared a meal with anyone." James immediately shook his head. "I can't. I need to get home early. It's a long drive back. Then stay here for the night," Ava replied. "There are plenty of empty guest rooms. I really can't. If I don't come home, Serena will worry." Ava picked up the empty fruit plate and started walking toward the house. Without turning around, she called back, If you refuse to stay for dinner, I'm not paying you. I'm only asking you to share a meal with me, not anything else. James stood there holding his shovel, unable to move. He couldn't understand why Ava had changed so much. Just days earlier, she had seemed reserved and distant, but now she was acting like a completely different person. At the same time, he had to admit that the attention from a beautiful and successful woman stirred something inside him. Still, he had no intention of betraying his family. Serena had stood beside him through every hardship, and he refused to forget that. Then another worry crossed his mind. If Ava truly withheld his pay, all of his hard work would be for nothing. His son's school expenses were due, and the food at home was already running low. With only one more day of work left, he needed to bring the money back to his family. After thinking it over, James convinced himself that staying for one dinner wouldn't hurt. He would eat quickly, thank Ava for the meal, and head straight home. That decision finally eased his mind. That evening, after James finished his work for the day, Ava had dinner ready and waiting. A large table in the dining room was covered with carefully prepared dishes, including fish, meat, seafood, vegetables, soup, and a bottle of good wine. "James, go wash up and come eat," Ava called from the kitchen as she carried the last few plates to the table. She had put great care into the meal and hoped her cooking would leave a lasting impression. "All right, Ava. I'll be there in a minute," James replied after rinsing the dust from his face and hands. When he sat down, he couldn't hide his surprise. The spread before him was far beyond anything he was used to. Most days, he and his family lived simply, and special meals were rare. Looking at the table filled with beautifully prepared food he had never even tasted before, James felt the same excitement as a child seeing an extraordinary meal for the first time. "To be honest, James, ever since my husband left, I've eaten every meal by myself," Ava said quietly as she placed a large piece of fish onto his plate. "Sometimes I make far more food than I can finish, but it never tastes the same when there's no one to share it with. I wish I had someone to sit across the table from me every day." James took a bite and nodded in approval. "That's why I keep telling you that you should find a good man to spend your life with. Having someone by your side is better than facing everything alone." He continued eating while taking small sips of wine. Ava's cooking was excellent, and the fish was tender and full of flavor. As they talked, she kept serving him more food without letting his plate stay empty. Good food, good company, and the wine gradually made James lose track of time. Before he realized it, the evening had grown late, and the promise he had made to himself that morning, to eat quickly and head home right away, had quietly slipped from his mind. By then, he was beginning to feel the effects of the alcohol, and Ava finally gathered the courage to speak. After a long silence, Ava looked directly at James and took a deep breath. "There's something I want to ask you," she said. "I hope you'll at least hear me out." James nodded without hesitation. "Go ahead. If it's something I can help with, I will." Ava hesitated for another moment before speaking. "Would you help me have a child? I've always wanted to be a mother. I don't even know if I'm still capable of having children, but I want to try just once. Please, James. Just this once." Her voice carried more desperation than confidence, as if she had held those words inside for years. James froze with his fork still in his hand. Several seconds passed before he fully understood what she meant. He slowly set his utensils down, took a sip of wine, and shook his head. "No, Ava, I can't do that. I'm a married man, and someone like me could never agree to something like this." "I know there are other men," Ava replied, "but I don't want anyone else. Ever since I met you, I haven't been able to stop thinking about this. I only want to know whether I'm capable of becoming a mother." James shook his head again. "No, Ava, there are far better choices than me. But I only want a child with you," she insisted. "I'm not asking for anything beyond that. I just want one chance to see if I can have a baby." "I can't," James answered firmly. "You should find someone, get married, and build a family the right way. A child deserves to grow up with both parents." Ava leaned forward. "If you never tell anyone, no one will know. I'll take care of everything myself," James sighed. "Even if you say that, what happens if you really become pregnant? I couldn't acknowledge the child, and if Serena ever found out, it would destroy my family." I'm not asking you to take responsibility, Ava pleaded. Just help me this once. After that, you can ask anything of me. James slowly pushed his chair back. I'm sorry, but I can't. There are many things I'm willing to do for you, but not this. With that, he stood up and reached for his hat, preparing to leave. Before James could walk away, Ava stepped in front of him and caught his arm. Caught off guard and still affected by the wine, he lost his balance as she led him into a nearby storage room. Inside, there was little more than an old wooden bed and a few things stacked against the walls. Ava held on to him, unwilling to let him leave. Standing so close, James caught the faint scent of her perfume, something completely unfamiliar to him. For a brief moment, his resolve began to weaken. A thought flashed through his mind that perhaps nothing would happen anyway, that maybe Ava truly couldn't have children. Sensing his hesitation, Ava looked at him and said, "Please help me. Every time I see you, I feel this longing grow stronger. If you agree, I'll handle everything else myself. You won't have to worry about anything." James took a slow breath and tried to steady himself. "Calm down, Ava. I came here to earn a living, not for anything like this." She loosened her grip but continued holding his hands, afraid he would leave the moment she let go. "Just give me a chance," she whispered. James looked at her for a long moment before answering. "You have to let me think about this. Any man would be shaken by a situation like this, but it's too sudden. Give me until tomorrow, and I'll give you my answer." Ava nodded reluctantly. "Promise me you'll tell me tomorrow. I can't keep waiting." Finally, she released him and watched him walk away. Left alone in the quiet room, Ava struggled with a storm of emotions. She knew what she was asking was wrong, yet the desire to become a mother refused to fade. She wasn't interested in any other man. For reasons she couldn't fully explain, she wanted that child only if James was the father. As tears gathered in her eyes, she wondered why meeting him had awakened feelings she believed had disappeared long ago. As for James, ever since he left Ava's house, he had been distracted. No matter what he was doing, his thoughts kept drifting back to what had happened, and he found it impossible to focus. Ava's face lingered in his mind wherever he went. That evening, as Serena folded the laundry beside their bed, James spoke up. "I'll be finished with the job at Ava's place tomorrow." Serena looked over at him with concern. "Has the work been difficult? How has she treated you? I've heard wealthy people can be demanding. Are you getting along with her? She hasn't been giving you a hard time, has she?" She worried because James had always been an honest and gentle man, and she hated the thought of anyone taking advantage of him. James looked at his wife quietly. She had always put her husband and children before herself, never complaining and never asking for much in return. He remembered when they first married through a family introduction. Back then, he had almost nothing except a willingness to work hard, and Serena had accepted that life without hesitation. The years passed quickly. Their oldest daughter was now grown and married, while their teenage son was still in school. James worked wherever he could, taking landscaping jobs when they were available and doing other physical labor when they weren't. Serena managed their small garden at home, growing vegetables for the family and selling the extra produce whenever she could. They had never been wealthy, but despite the hardships, they had built a peaceful home together, the kind of life many people wish they had. Serena noticed that James had been staring at her for a long time and finally asked, "What's wrong? Why are you looking at me like that?" Her voice pulled him back to reality, and he flinched as if he had been caught doing something he shouldn't. "Nothing," he answered awkwardly. "Go get some rest. I have to leave early again tomorrow." But that night, sleep never came. Every time he closed his eyes, Ava appeared in his thoughts. He remembered her face, the scent of her perfume, the way she had stood close to him, and the warmth of her touch. The memories kept returning, no matter how hard he tried to push them away. James loved his wife and children, yet he was still an ordinary man facing a temptation unlike anything he had ever experienced. Ava represented a life he had never imagined for himself. And for a brief moment that afternoon, he had almost given in. Looking back on it now, he realized how close he had come to making a decision he would have regretted for the rest of his life. As the night dragged on, James found himself arguing with his own conscience. One part of him wondered if giving in just once would really change anything. Once the landscaping job was finished, he and Ava would probably never see each other again. A small voice tempted him to experience something he had never known before. But another thought quickly followed. What if Ava became pregnant? He could never acknowledge the child without destroying his own family, and abandoning that responsibility would go against everything he believed in. Then his mind drifted in the opposite direction. Ava had spent years in a previous marriage without having children. Maybe she couldn't conceive at all. If that were true, perhaps nothing would happen even if he crossed the line. The conflicting thoughts chased each other through his head, refusing to let him rest. The thoughts continued until the first rooster crowed at daybreak. James had barely slept, but he got out of bed right away and prepared for work. The final moments from the previous afternoon still lingered in his mind, especially the embrace that had nearly broken his resolve. Even so, he picked up his tools and set out for Ava's house before sunrise. The trip took time, and with only a small portion of the project left unfinished, he wanted to arrive early and complete it as quickly as possible. When James arrived, Ava greeted him the same way she always did, handing him a cup of hot tea before he started working. "You're here early again today," she said. "I wanted to finish the job while it's still cool outside," James replied, taking a sip. "Then stay for dinner again tonight," Ava said. "I picked up some fresh meat and fish this morning and was planning to cook a few dishes." James tried to decline politely. "You really don't have to go to so much trouble." "It's no trouble at all," she answered. As he worked through the yard, Ava stayed close instead of returning to the house. She followed him from one area to another, telling him about her daily life, the loneliness she had carried for years, and the quiet sadness of living in such a large home without a family to share it with. Whether she was simply opening her heart or hoping he would sympathize with her, James couldn't be sure. But as he listened to her story, he found himself feeling genuinely sorry for her. That day, Ava dressed differently from before, choosing clothes that drew more attention than her usual outfits. Whenever James happened to glance in her direction, he quickly looked away, embarrassed, while Ava seemed to pay little notice to his discomfort. By the afternoon, she had prepared another generous dinner, complete with good food and wine. As they ate together, she kept bringing up the conversation they had shared the previous evening, returning again and again to her wish of having a child. Each mention made James more uneasy. Faced with her persistence and the emotions she openly expressed, he struggled to keep his composure, and the color slowly rose in his face. As the evening went on, Ava continued talking about what she had asked of James the day before, hoping he would eventually change his mind. She had prepared another fine meal and poured him more wine, while James listened in silence, offering only brief replies. The food, the alcohol, and the hours they had spent together gradually lowered his guard. Unlike the previous night, he no longer insisted on leaving as soon as dinner ended. Instead, he remained seated with a cup of tea in his hands while Ava pulled her chair closer and continued speaking to him in a calm, familiar tone. The questions and doubts that had troubled him only a day earlier began to fade under the weight of fatigue and drink. By then, James realized he was no longer thinking with the same clarity he had before. Ava invited James into a quiet room so he could sit down and rest before heading home. He lowered himself onto the edge of the bed, still affected by the wine, and stared silently at the floor. After a long pause, Ava finally broke the silence. "Do you really feel nothing when you look at me?" she asked. "There are plenty of men who would love to be in your place, but the only reason I've opened my heart is because I care about you and still dream of becoming a mother." James looked uneasy. "You're being very direct, Ava. It honestly frightens me. And if what you're suggesting actually happened and you ended up pregnant, what would I do? I have a family waiting for me at home," Ava answered without hesitation. "If I ever had a child, I would raise that child myself. I'm fully capable of providing for a family, and I would never ask anything from you. No one else has to know. If neither of us says a word, this stays between us. Besides, there's no guarantee I could even have children. I only want the chance to find out." James let out a long breath. "I'm still afraid. If Serena ever learned about this, I don't know how I could face her or my children." Ava tried to reassure him. "Then stop worrying about everything that might happen. You're carrying too much fear with you." Ava moved closer and continued trying to persuade James, while he sat there struggling with himself. The conversation gradually gave way to silence as both of them understood what the other was thinking without saying it outright. James still worried about Serena, his children, and everything he stood to lose, yet the certainty he had shown before was fading. Ava reminded him once more that she would keep everything private and would never ask him to abandon his family or take responsibility for anything beyond that night. He knew crossing that line would betray the people waiting for him at home, and he also knew he might regret it for the rest of his life. Even so, exhaustion, alcohol, and the emotions that had been building over the past several days left him unable to think as clearly as before. Little by little, he stopped resisting and let the moment carry him forward, pushing thoughts of tomorrow and whatever consequences might follow to the back of his mind. Left alone with his emotions and no longer thinking clearly, James finally gave in to the choice he had resisted for days. The boundaries he had tried so hard to protect slipped away, and he and Ava began an intimate relationship despite knowing the consequences it could bring. Outside, a heavy rain fell through the evening, while inside the house, Ava held on to a single hope: that this might be her last chance to become a mother. For her, the moment carried not only affection but years of longing, disappointment, and the desire to prove that she was still capable of having a child. James, meanwhile, could not erase the knowledge that he was betraying the family he loved, yet he lacked the strength to stop himself. He pushed aside thoughts of tomorrow, of Serena, and of everything that might follow. In that moment, both of them allowed emotion to outweigh judgment, leaving the future to unfold on its own. When everything was over, the room fell silent. Ava looked at James and quietly admitted that she wished they had met under different circumstances, even imagining how different her life might have been if she had known him years earlier. James said very little. His mind was already somewhere else. He kept telling himself that what had happened could never happen again. To him, it had been a terrible mistake, one he intended to bury forever. Once he finished the job at Ava's house, he planned to return to his normal life and never come back. He hoped this would remain a secret that no one would ever discover. After sitting quietly for a while, Ava looked at James with a satisfied smile. "You've made me happier than you can imagine," she said. "Will you stay here with me tonight?" James immediately shook his head as he reached for his clothes. "I can't. If I don't go home, Serena will panic and start looking for me. I already feel guilty enough. Sometimes I wish I had never taken this job." Ava lowered her eyes for a moment before answering, "Hearing that makes me sad. Just remember that you'll always be welcome here. If you ever decide to come back, my door will be open." James paused but didn't respond. After getting dressed, he quietly said, "I have to go now." James left Ava's house carrying a burden far heavier than when he had arrived. In the moment, he had let emotion and impulse take over, but now all that remained was regret. As he made his way home, he worried that Serena might notice something had changed or somehow discover the truth. He replayed the evening over and over, wondering how he had crossed a line he had sworn he would never cross. The farther he traveled from Ava's house, the stronger his guilt became. Torn between shame, fear, and uncertainty, James could no longer tell what the right thing to do was. The next morning, James realized he had left without collecting his pay because he had been too distracted by everything that had happened. He made the long trip back to Ava's house one last time. As always, she welcomed him warmly and made sure he was well taken care of. Before he left, she kept her promise by paying him generously and even bought several new outfits for his children. James accepted the money and gifts with gratitude, feeling that this had been the most unforgettable job of his life. Ava quietly told him he would always be welcome if he ever wished to visit again, but James had already made up his mind. No matter what happened in the future, he would never set foot in that house again. After that final meeting, James returned to his ordinary life, but the memories stayed with him. Sometimes he felt drawn back to what had happened, and other times he was overwhelmed by guilt and regret. Even though Ava had invited him to visit whenever he wanted, he never went back. Ava also missed James, but she chose to keep her distance. She knew he had a wife and children waiting for him and refused to become the reason another family fell apart. Instead, she held on to one quiet hope. She prayed that the brief relationship they had shared might leave behind the one thing she had wanted for so many years, a child of her own. She understood the chances were uncertain, but she continued to hope with every passing day. Time passed, and before long, Ava began noticing changes in her body that she had never experienced before. She kept those suspicions to herself, telling no one while quietly waiting for answers. As the weeks turned into months, her hope grew stronger. Then, about 3 months later, the signs became impossible to ignore. Looking at herself in the mirror, she realized she was finally pregnant. Tears filled her eyes as years of disappointment gave way to relief and joy. After believing for so long that motherhood might never happen for her, Ava understood that the child she had dreamed of was now growing inside her. At last, she had received the blessing she had wished for all those years. 9 months later, the quiet house that had once felt empty was filled with the sound of a newborn baby crying. At nearly 40 years old, Ava held her son in her arms for the first time and struggled to contain her emotions. The loneliness that had followed her for so many years suddenly seemed far away. More than once, she thought about telling James the news and sharing the happiness with him, but every time she reached that thought, she stopped herself. In the end, she chose silence. She believed keeping the truth to herself was the only way to protect the peaceful life James had built with his family. Years later, James happened to meet Shirley, the relative who had originally recommended him for the landscaping job at Ava's home. During their conversation, she mentioned that she had moved in with Ava to help care for a young boy after Ava became a mother. She also explained that Ava had never revealed the child's father to anyone. Hearing that, James quietly counted back the timeline in his mind and reached a conclusion he could not ignore. He believed the boy was almost certainly his son. The realization filled him with guilt, yet he also understood why Ava had kept the secret. Rather than disrupting the life he shared with Serena and their family, she had chosen to raise the child on her own. James promised himself that one day, if the circumstances were ever right, he would acknowledge the truth. Meanwhile, Ava treasured her son above all else and devoted herself to raising him with love and care. She made a private promise that when the time was right, she would tell him who his father was and let him decide what to do with that knowledge. For the time being, James felt he had no choice but to remain silent and continue living his life as before. Meanwhile, Ava held her baby boy in her arms with extraordinary care, cherishing him more than anything else. To her, he was the unexpected result of a brief chapter in her life that had changed everything. She quietly promised both herself and her son that she would raise him with love and do everything she could to give him a good future. When the right time came, she would tell him who his father was. In the end, one summer changed the course of 2 lives. Ava's determination to become a mother led James to cross a boundary he had never imagined crossing. And the child who was born from that decision brought lasting joy to a woman who had spent years believing motherhood might never be possible for her. In contrast to Ava's happiness, James carried a sense of guilt that stayed with him for the rest of his life. A single moment of failing to control his own desires left him feeling that he had betrayed the woman who had stood by him through so many years. In reality, the line between reason and temptation can be separated by only a brief moment, yet that moment can change the course of many lives. Before giving in to any temptation or making a decision that cannot be undone, it is worth thinking about the people who trust us and the consequences our actions may have for them.